Hi and welcome. In today's video I will explain all the basics related to wrenches or spanners, and it may sound like a basic tool and many people take this for granted, but not everyone knows how to use them properly and all the different types and what each is good for. And I have seen even unexperienced mechanics make mistakes and cause damage to either what they are working on or tools or both. So I think it's a good idea to make a video like this, and it will sort of condense my decades of practical experience and theoretical learning into one video. So this video will not be very short, but I will make a table of contents visible in the timeline and in the video's description. And if you see through this whole video, by the end you will have learned, hopefully, and understood these things or concepts. So the metric and imperial wrench sizes, wrench thickness and why it matters, open, box end and flare or brake hose wrenches, the angle of open end wrenches, hexagonal 12-point and 12-splined design of box end wrenches, straight and offset wrenches, uni-directional and bi-directional ratcheting wrenches, and even I'll touch upon polished and matte finish. And finally I will give some recommendations and my apologies in advance for any spelling mistakes, awful 5-year-old handwriting and drawing, and my imperfect English. If I get any terms wrong, please use the comment section below to correct me. And also, if you think that I've missed something or misexplained or made some mistake, please use the comment section below. So that's a very long introduction, but now we can start, and I've made this table of contents in order to not miss to mention anything. Just 1 second. I almost forgot, I use Imperial sized tools very rarely, and people who are in the United States are probably, or who work with equipment that are in United States will most probably work more with those. So for the example of Imperial sizes I only have a set of sockets, but it will be enough to explain the basics. And also, before we start, what I will not be talking about are the very special niche wrenches such as headset, threaded headset wrench, or bicycle hub cone wrench, or bicycle pedal wrench. These wrenches should only be used for what their name says and for that application, and they should not be used for anything else, nor will you generally be able to use normal, ordinary wrenches for these uses. These require a separate video, so to not make this last for 10 hours like Lord of the Rings, I will not be discussing these any further. Just note that for cones, pedals and headsets you generally want to use these. I'm mentioning this because I did see people use cone wrench to remove or mount bicycle wheels, for example, and that's not a good idea. This should be used only for hubs when you're servicing cup and cone hubs. But again, we will not be discussing this. In this video I will be discussing the wrenches for general mechanics and fixing stuff. So when it comes to wrenches, the first thing, logical difference in my opinion, is the sizes of metric and imperial. They are different standards. Some wrenches of imperial standard are very close in size to some metric wrenches, but they are not a very good match. So you can make a mistake or a problem. For example, here I have a 15mm bolt or nut. However, this is a very strange design, but it will work well to demonstrate. So if I try to find an imperial socket that fits, this is the closest one that fits. This is 5/8, I think, and you see how much play there is. So this one is likely to damage the nut if I need to unscrew a stuck nut, while if I use a 15 millimeter metric socket or wrench, there's almost no play. So, and the same goes vice versa. If you are working with Imperial nuts and bolts, you need to get the Imperial wrenches. And when you are getting a wrench set, it is my recommendation to get them in a set to cover all the sizes. For example, for metrics, you want to go from 8, 9, 10, 11, they are in 1 millimeter increments, so from 8 millimeters to 17 millimeters. And if you buy sets that have some of those missing, you are very likely to be needing the ones that are missing, at least in my experience. And if you want to be really thorough, it's generally a good idea to cover the range from 6 millimeters all the way from the rather small ones to at least 19 or even 32 if you're working with some larger equipment and so on. So generally try to get a full set if possible. We'll talk more about that in chapter 9, recommendations. And so it's important to use the right size. And the difference between metric and Imperial is, I hope I've explained that properly. Now let's go on to the next topic, the thickness. I touched upon that when I mentioned the cone wrenches. See how thin they are. This is an extreme example, and the cone wrenches are generally used for when you cannot reach with a different size wrench because they have very thin axis and wider areas on both sides, and that's when you need to use these. But they have a very thin area where you apply force, so you're more likely to cause damage to a bolt or nut, and also to cause damage to a wrench. These are considered generally to be a wear and replace item because they will get damaged more quickly over time than a regular sized wrench. So the thickness does matter, and generally here I have some normal wrenches. These are all 15 millimeters, but you can see this one is relatively thick, and compare it to this one, see the difference in thickness. Now for some tasks it is good to have thinner wrenches so that you can approach a problem. I will show an example in just a minute. And for others, it's good when you have a greater area so that you can apply more force over a wider area to cause to have less probability of deforming the nut or bolt or damaging the wrench. However, there is a caveat. Some manufacturers use cheaper materials, and to compensate they make their wrenches thicker. So it's not always better to have thicker or thinner wrenches. It depends. It's generally a good idea to have wrenches that are not too thick and of good quality. That's, in my opinion, best. And now just to compare these two extremes, this one is almost 7 millimeters. This is around 7 millimeters thick for 15 millimeter size, and this one is older junior. This is just over 5 millimeters thick. So there is a lot of difference, and it can be a problem. I will show how in just 1 second. Let me follow me please to this dirty part. This is the lock nuts for preload for chain tension tuning on my motorcycle, and here in order to work it you need to hold one bolt, then loosen the other, then set the preload, and then tighten them against each other. However, this wrench is just a tad too thick, so it does tend to catch both nuts when you're trying to work it. I might make it work or maybe not, but with this one I have some room to spare. So that's the situation when it's a good idea to have a thinner wrench. Okay, so now we'll go back. The other extreme situation is if I want to apply a huge amount of torque, then it's generally better to have that spread over a wider area, especially if it's a softer material we're working with. So again, pros and cons. Generally I prefer to not have wrenches that are on the thick side, and I don't like these for being so thick. I'll make a separate video about this. These are made by Park Tools, and we'll get that in a separate video, but these are just a bit too thick for my taste. Now let's discuss the open and box end and flare wrenches. Now this is an open end wrench, and it has two sizes. So we have 15 and 14 millimeter in one wrench, and this is practical for saving you some space because you get two sizes in one wrench. You don't have to carry two, but the downside is that it has only open ends. We'll get a bit more into that later. This is a combination wrench that has both the open end and the box end. This, when it is all enclosed, is called a box end. The box end has some very good advantages that I'll discuss in a minute, but this one lets me choose. Sometimes I cannot put this over a nut for whatever reason, either because it's enclosed in some system or similar, or as you saw in that situation for that lock nut, it's sometimes narrow in space, so I have to use the flat end. And so it's more convenient to use the flat end, and sometimes it's when it's possible to reach, it's generally a good idea to use the box end because it allows you to use a lot more torque. And this is what I mean. You know, when you look at the open end and when you're trying to work a bolt, it only uses these two sides to apply torque. So in two places it puts some load on this section and on the opposite side on this section, and that's all you get for leverage. And when you use a box end, then you have a lot more points of contact to apply the force, and it cannot slip off, it cannot move anyway. This one can more easily slip, and so this has nowhere to go to expand or anything. So if you need to loosen a stuck bolt, it's better to use some box end wrench, and that's why for me this is the better design compared to having this, but these come in handy when you need two sizes. You can also get box end wrenches that have two sizes of box ends, but then if you need an open end because you cannot reach onto something, then it can be a problem. So that's one thing. And flare wrenches, or brake hose wrenches as they are called, are wrenches that look like a box end wrench but have a small cutout, not a complete cutout like here, but the box end is almost enclosed but not completely. And they are useful, for example, if you are working on brake lines. Let's imagine this is a brake line screwed onto a caliper, and this is a brake hose that goes to the brake actuating lever. So you haven't got any place to put this over because it's all enclosed system. So in that case you would have to use either a flat wrench, but that does not provide you a lot of purchases, I had just explained. So you would use a flare wrench, which is like a box end with a cutout, so you have just enough cutout to get over the hose, and then you can place it over and have it cover the bolt from more than just two sides. So it's a compromise, but it's you work with the best thing you have, with the best tool you have. I generally manage to get by with using just very wide jaws of these open end wrenches when I'm working with brake lines and similar, but for professional use and generally if you are working a lot with that, it's a good idea to get flare wrenches. They are usually a bit wider to get you more area, more contact area, and better spread load. Now open end angle. Yes, what do I mean by that? Some of these open end wrenches, you can see that this is a bit at an angle. Sometimes that angle is a bit more exaggerated than this, and sometimes it's nearer to being flat. But generally it's not very practical if it is completely flat. I will show you now why using a simple example. Just give me a second. Here, if we want to work on this nut, and let's say that it is connected so that we cannot use the box end section, that this is enclosed all the way, and let's say that this has some top cover, so I cannot come from any other side. I have to come from here. This angle, if I want to screw this in, allows me to turn it until I hit this limit, and then here there is not enough room to get a purchase past this point. I cannot do that, but I can flip it over to change this angle, and now hopefully here I'm just able to get this over and continue turning it. So I cannot catch it here, and that would make no sense, but here just enough, you can see, so I can move it. And now again I have to flip it over. And so it's a slow, tedious process, but you are making progress. So it helps. And if this angle is too great, then you don't have so many angles of adjustment, and if it is a bit straighter, then you have a bit more wiggle room, but you will be making generally slower progress. So it's a trade-off, but it helps, and it's there for a good reason. Now let's move on. Hexagonal versus 12-point versus splined profile of box end wrenches. Let's talk about that. Here I do have a splined box end wrench, and this is what it looks like. These are like some small splines placed around the whole circle. The more traditional design would be to have them a bit more like a zigzag line. I don't have that one to show you, but I will try to. Here I draw like a 13-year-old, but I hope you can see the picture on the board. Here this is the one that looks mostly like a 12-point system, so this is not splined. And this is a drawing, my attempt to draw a bit exaggerated. This is with splines, this is with 12-point system, and this is hexagonal profile. To show that one, I haven't got any box end wrenches with hexagonal profile, I only have a socket, but that is the profile that you would see in a box end of a hexagonal profile box end wrench. Now, what are the pros and cons of different designs? Well, the splined and 12-point system allow you a lot of more degrees of adjustment. Let me show you. Here this is the splined one. So with the hexagonal profile, let's just show a hexagonal profile for a second. Just a brief digression. With the hexagonal profile, this will be acting as a wrench. You are facing that problem of not being able to choose. When you turn it, then you need to place it on the other end. I cannot do it. I would be hitting this if this were lower. So I would be having a problem. I would not be able to make any more progress generally. But with the splined system, I have a lot more places where I can make a purchase. So here I have 2 spots to choose from, almost 3. That is the advantage of the 12-point and the splined system. Their disadvantage is that they cannot provide as much leverage and as much torque. So if you need to loosen a very stuck, rusty nut or bolt, it's best to have a hexagonal profile, either using a socket with a breaker bar if you can approach, or a box end with a hexagonal profile. I don't have box end screwdrivers with a hexagonal profile, but I usually manage to improvise with sockets, and usually I'm able to reach the areas that I'm working on, but that is not always the case. So those are the pros and cons, and for 12 point versus splines. Some manufacturers swear that their splined method is and design is super radical, advanced, and will provide you a lot more torque and so on. And generally that is not always the case. With some models it is, with some it isn't, and many people will probably disagree, especially salespeople and manufacturers. But in my experience, the 12-point system is a bit more, you know what to expect with splines. Sometimes they work super, sometimes they work a bit worse than the 12-point system. And it also depends on the particular size, particular material of the bolt you're working on, and many other things. So splines are a bit more here and there, at least in my opinion and experience. And what I else wanted to note, I'll get back to it if I remember, cannot remember now what I also wanted to note about this. Yes, generally the 6-point is by far the hexagonal profile is by far the best grip and the highest torque that you can achieve with it generally. So hands down, no competition, and these two are so-so. So yes, the 12-point nuts and bolts. There are some bolts that have 12-point profile that do not have a 6-point profile like this one, and for those you can use either 12-point or spline system. They will both work, but the hexagonal will not. So that's another thing. And so in case I came across such a nut, this socket that I have would not fit and would not let me work on it. I would have to get some wrench that is with 12 points or splines. Okay, so that's all I wanted to know about points and splines. And now let's move on. Straight and offset wrenches. Yes, here this wrench is completely straight, and when I put it over its box end, when I put it over a nut, if I'm tightening it all the way down, I haven't got much room and might hurt my knuckles when I'm trying to turn it or unscrew it, or if it's all the way down tightened with some thinner nut, I would not be able to get a good grip. This one, on the other hand, has this at an angle. So this allows me to have some room for my arms as I'm working. This angle is very often a very good idea. You can use both sides to get two angles depending on what you're working on, but sometimes it does get in the way. So with bicycles I often prefer to use flat wrenches. So there are pros and cons, but if you can only buy one, generally an angle is good. This is a special case of an offset wrench where the offset is set to keep the lever almost parallel and to have this go straight down. Sometimes when you have some recesses, then this does not cut it and you need to use something like this. So there are different kinds of angles and they have their pros, and generally it's a good idea to have this at an angle. There are fewer situations where it gets in the way so that you cannot work around it, in my experience, but if you can have both types, it's not bad to have both. Okay, so I've covered that, and now let's talk about ratcheting wrenches. And with ratcheting wrenches, there are two types. This one is uni-directional, and that's one of the reasons why they made it flat, because it will only ratchet in one direction. So if you want to screw something in, you go this way. If you want to unscrew it, you flip it over and you are unscrewing it. If it were made with an angle, then you would have problems unscrewing some bolt that is smaller, lower, like this one. It's also generally not a good idea to try to use this at an angle, even if you can. The same goes for flat. Generally you should avoid using them at an angle and try to get them as parallel as possible, or at least to have the entire section of the wrench cover the flats. So generally, I forgot to mention that. So if I had to use this if it were made with an angle, it would be a problem. I would have an awkward situation. So that's one thing. The other type are those that have a directional switch. Just a second. This is not a wrench, but ratcheting wrenches that are bi-directional have a switch like this, so you have one position for unscrewing and the other position for screwing in. Those, because they have the reverse option, can and often are made at an angle. Sometimes they even have a head that can pivot, which is for me the least convenient option, because the pivoting head always pivots when I don't want it to pivot. But that's a separate topic. I won't be going into huge amount of details. Anyway, so there is that option, and compared to unidirectional wrenches, the unidirectional wrenches, generally, all else being equal, the size, the manufacturing quality and everything, do allow you, in theory, to make a stronger mechanism that will take more torque. You generally don't want to use any kind of ratcheting wrench to loosen a very stuck bolt. For that, you should use a socket with a breaker bar or a box end wrench with a hexagonal profile, preferably. So these are generally not advised, or it's generally not advised smart to use these for loosening stuck bolts or nuts. However, you sometimes need to tighten to a greater torque, and this design in theory allows manufacturer, because it's all cramped in a small place, but there's no directional switch, so they can make this be a bit stronger. But that is not always the case. It depends on the manufacturer, so don't take it as a gospel and don't rely on it. Try to see the maximum allowed torque to be applied for your ratcheting wrench when you're buying. That is something that manufacturers don't readily disclose on their product sheets, unfortunately, and in my experience the production quality is getting worse for tools in general over the past decades, and it's getting less of the same quality. So there's more fluctuations in quality, and the general trend is towards lower durability and lower robustness. I'll make a separate video on that, but that is my opinion based on my education and my experience. You are of course free to disagree, especially if you're selling tools. And that's about another advantage of the bidirectional wrenches. I don't have one, but this will act as a bidirectional wrench, is that sometimes you can get stuck. This is not a very likely scenario if you have and are using a bidirectional wrench, but if you're using a unidirectional wrench, you will surely get into that situation, because that's the Murphy's law. So if I am, say, unscrewing something with this wrench, and we are getting further and further out, and I reach a situation where this part that I'm screwing out has come very close to some other thing that limits any further movement. So if I might have problems to remove my tool if it is too thick. And sometimes if something else gets in the way and you forgot to dismount that, and that is required by the manufacturer, you will not be able to unscrew the bolt completely, and you will not be able to remove your wrench. Now, of course, the logical thing to do would be to screw it back in, but if your wrench is just unidirectional, you will not be able to apply any torque to tighten it. That's where bidirectional wrenches are a good idea. You can save the day by using another wrench, but sometimes you don't have room to come with another wrench and you can get stuck, and that is one thing to pay extra attention to, and that is, in my opinion, a big downside of unidirectional wrenches, though I find them very convenient for bicycle working because they are not cramped, everything is open and you have room to remove stuff generally. So again, everything has its pros and cons. Let us move on. Polished and matte, or however it is properly called in English, finish. It's irrelevant. It's a matter of personal preference and taste. Again, this is my opinion based on my experience. Some people would very passionately disagree with me now. But generally, if I had to make some distinctions and comparisons, I would say that with the greasy hands, the rougher finish, let me show first what I mean. Okay, so This is what I mean by some rougher finish. This is like some pearly sort of finish, the part that I haven't ruined by my poor paint job. This is more classic matte finish, like it's not very shiny, and this is very shiny and very polished finish, like chrome. And so the poor quality wrenches will rust and flake and create all sorts of problems. So in those terms, it boils down to the quality of the wrench, not the finish, the type of wrenches finishing surface. And apart from aesthetics, some are easier to clean from one type of dirt or similar, and some look better when they are beaten up or scratched a bit more, because scratches show a lot more on the shiny ones, but it's mostly aesthetics and type of taste. The only difference, if I had to make one distinction, is that the rougher finish ones are a bit better when you're working with greasy hands. Even though generally, if you hold the tools properly and use the proper techniques, and you can always clean your hands, if nothing else, on your clothes, if you are in a rush, you can get around that. But generally, the rougher finish is less slippery with greasy hands, and the shiny finish is less slippery with drier hands. I would say that. So it's a bit counterintuitive, but it's a bit more sticky. These ones have plastic and everything, so they're not a really good example, but that's general idea. And now finally for recommendations. You will probably get disappointed, but the high quality wrenches that I have used over the years are now all about a decade old or older. So and I've noticed that the quality of tools that are manufactured today is not as good as it used to be. You can call me retro grouch or an old person saying things like from their youth, but this is my opinion, and I am trying to find high quality new tools, because tools get damaged and wear over time. But generally, you can look at my video of comparison of 50-year-old Facom and new Vera Hex Plus Super Duper Hex Key or Allen wrench comparison for a brief overview. But generally, the quality of tools has diminished, and so at this moment, if I were forced to buy new tools, what I would do, I'm not saying that this is what you should do, but this is the best that I can think about if I'm considering to buy tools for myself. I would go to a local tool hardware store, and in the United States, I think Harbor Freight, or however it's pronounced properly, is a good place to start and get some medium priced set of wrenches. Not the most expensive, but not the cheapest ones. So I'd get a mid-price set of wrenches and start using them, and if they're working for me, great. If they are not working for me, I would see which one of those I use most often, which one gets damaged and worn first, and go and get a more expensive wrench in that size, only one, to give it a test, if it's the size that I'm working most with. And if I had to now go and make a purchase, in Europe I would look at Bahco tools, B-A-H-C-O, Bahco, I'm not sure how they're pronounced. And in the United States, I believe that a company called Milwaukee is a good place to start. I haven't tried their wrenches, especially the new ones from the last 5 years, but that's where I would start. And if they work okay for me, good, then I can see how much money I need to save to get the whole set, and that's it. If they don't, I would go with the next a bit expensive model brand. So I would try Bahco, Milwaukee, then see about Proxon. That company used to make good tools. I'm not sure about today. Facom is also a good company, but anyway, that is the algorithm and the logic that I would use in order to find a good set of wrenches if some medium priced from local hardware stores don't do the job. And I cannot go and tell you buy this set, it's great, because I cannot recommend something that I haven't personally confirmed to be good. And I think that's more fair. And I'm very sorry if I've disappointed you, but I really cannot. I would love to be able to tell you buy this low-end price or mid-range product or high-end, but I cannot do that because everything that I have is very old, and this set has not been with me for more than a month, so I really cannot talk about its quality and durability. All I can say about this set of Park Tool wrenches is that they are, for now, not bad. I will see if they are really good and how they hold up, but for now they are okay, and I will make a separate video on them after I have given them some time and some use and abuse. They are far from a high quality tool, but they are not bad. So that is the whole video. Thank you very much if you sat through this entire video. Please use the comment section, especially if you have some additions or corrections, because I always learn new things and I also make mistakes or have some gaps in my knowledge. So it's a great YouTube. I love YouTube for being able to have a two-way communication. The same goes for my website. So, and that's it. Again, thank you very much for watching, and I will see you in some other video. Cheers, stay cool.